So let us talk force weapons, psi cannons, and psychic rituals, with an overview of the strengths and weaknesses of every Grey Knight's unit. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Grey Knights, and I thought we'd go through the units in the Codex as we have with many of the other codexes of 40k, and talk about some of the positives and negatives of running each unit in the book. Since their codex released almost a year ago now, the Grey Knights have had it generally quite good. Strong performances at tournaments with a bunch of units that are dangerous in shooting, melee and psychic, though over the last few months they have been codex creeped a bit. The latest releases have been very strong indeed. I'd say they're now one of the more mid-tier armies of 40k, not as standout as some of the top dogs. In this video I thought we'd go through each and every unit in the codex, talk about the positives and negatives of running them in a Grey Knight army, and an overall score out of 10 for how strong I would rate them at the moment. Obviously people's playstyles differ a bit, there's plenty of ways that you can run things, and things might be stronger in different lists. I'm always happy to hear alternate takes on which units you think are stronger and weaker down in the comments. With that being said, we'll go through each section in the codex one by one, starting with the troops, then going to the elites, and each of the rest in turn. So first up, we'll start out strong with the Grey Knight Strike Squad. They're a troops choice for just 22 points per model, and I'd currently say they're pretty much the default choice that you want to be bringing in the troops slot. A solid all-round unit, some fairly decent anti-infantry shooting, very solid melee with damage 2 when they get in combat, and they can amp that up with Hammer Hand if they need to. Though they can also use Smite for an extra little bit of damage, and they can also do psychic actions if you need them to. They perhaps might be one of the better choices for psychic actions, a unit that's often going to be hanging around on objectives in your deployment zone anyway, and their cast can sometimes be a little bit less valuable than subbing out a Dominus power. On top of that, they are the cheapest troop slot for filling out detachments for battalions or patrols, and that is quite a big advantage over the Terminators. In general, I'd say that Grey Knight Strike Squads are a very solid element to a list. It's not uncommon to see 3 squads of these filling out a battalion detachment for Grey Knight lists. Maybe their main weaknesses is that they're a little bit on the slow side. It's kind of hard to guarantee that they're going to get in melee or Stormbolter range if they're sat on the board. And although they do have Armour of Contempt, which makes them particularly durable in cover or with Tide of Shadows, still high AP damage 2 weapons will go through the squad at least fairly easily. Overall though, very solid troops, very decent damage dealers that your opponent can't usually afford to underestimate for a countercharge. I've ranked them a 9 out of 10. Next up we have the Grey Knight Terminator squads, 40 points per model and the other troops choice of the codex. Terminator armour with the 2+ save is particularly hardy with Armour of Contempt, and having them be objective secured is even nicer on top of that. Again, they can smite and hammer hand, have a little bit better firepower on the move with their storm bolters, and they can also have their +1 to hit stratagem for 1 command point, which is pretty nice. I'd say their main downside is they still kind of compare suboptimally compared with the strike squads. 1 Terminator almost costs as much as 2 Strike Marines for 44 points, and although you can make arguments about their durability, in general the Strike Marines will deal far more damage for the cost, plus have more psychic casts. For big anvil units to build around as well, a lot of people tend to prefer Paladins, and generally at the moment I'd argue that Terminators are usable, though generally a bit suboptimal compared with Strikes or Paladins. I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10. Speaking of which, we'll move on to the Elite slot next, and we have the Paladin squad, 45 points per model, so 5 points more than the Terminators. And for that they do lose their Brotherhood keyword, but they do get to hit on 2s and get access to an excellent Sanctic Discipline power. When Armour of Contempt came out, Paladin squads went from being kind of okay to rather excellent. Armour of Resilience gives them a further +1 to their save, so if you're shooting at them with things like AP -3, they'll typically be saving on a 3+ normally, and a 2+ if you can get them in light cover at the same time, and that's kind of easily done with the Tide of Shadows. Their shooting damage is okay, you can give them a few special weapons if they need them, but in melee they are really quite threatening, hitting on 2s and getting an extra attack compared with the Terminators. It's very common to see a big brick of Paladins somewhere in a Grey Knight list. Even a unit of 5 of them can give you an anvil that's just massively hard for your opponent to shift, and hopefully dominate one objective. In terms of weaknesses, they don't have objectives secured unless you run a Warlord trait alongside them with a character, though this is fairly reasonable to do. Unyielding anvil on something like a Brotherhood Apothecary nearby seems pretty good, though I would say that perhaps they do have slightly diminishing returns if you take more than 1 squad, seeing as only 1 squad can use Armoured Resilience. As well as that, they don't have the Brotherhood keyword, which does lock them out of a few synergies, certain stratagems and powers and things, but I think that they're a really solid unit in their own right. I'd score them a 9 out of 10, very tempting to take in Grey Knight lists these days. Next up we've got the Purifier squad. the Elite Grey Knights with the Purifying Flame. They're 23 points per model, so 1 point more than the Strike Squads, and they really have two different reasons why you might want to take them. First up is Purifying Flame, which gives you a flat 3 mortal wounds, really quite a nice bonus to damage output, kicking out more mortal wounds than the strikes each turn, and they also have a 2 command point stratagem for -1 damage, really nice on 2 wound infantry if they get targeted by something like overcharged plasma weapons, basically cutting that damage output in half. On the downside, you could argue that they just don't really do all that much that strike squads don't do already. They lack objectives secured and don't fill troop slots, both of which are big negatives over the strikes. And if you are going for more elite grey knights that you're spending more points on, a lot of people prefer things like fast moving interceptors to actually get the melee where it needs to be. Again, I'd say they're a unit that's absolutely fine, though just maybe a tiny bit eclipsed. I'd score them an 8 out of 10. I think a squad of them's maybe okay, perhaps charging out of a rhino or something, though in general the vast majority of Grey Knight lists are more likely to field strike squads than these guys. Next up we have Grey Knight Dreadnoughts and Venerable Dreadnoughts, 130 to 145 points depending on whether you go for the Dreadnought or the Venerable one. Out of the two, I think the points differential is in favour of the Venerable. 15 points for hitting on 2s and the 6+ Feel No Pain, both I think add up to being more useful than the Dreadnought. I guess in the Dreadnought's favour, being a smaller unit, it is slightly more efficient for the psychic casts, but I still think that the Venerable one is better overall. On the positives, they bring long-range anti-tank to a Grey Knight army. Their most efficient damage generally tends to be 24-inch range, so it is quite nice to have some backfield threats, and they're also core units, so can profit from rerolls, and they do have the pop-up 1 command point stratagem to make another reroll aura, so you could have a phalanx of Dreadnoughts rerolling 1s to hit and wounds. They also have either Smite or Armoured Resilience. If you aren't using Paladins, then Armoured Resilience does make them into a fairly durable gun turret, though if you are using Paladins, it's so much better on them. For weaknesses, I'd say that the anti-tank guns just aren't particularly outstanding for the cost on the downside. Generally Dread Knights have a bit more efficient shooting, plus double up as melee threats, and I'm just not really convinced too much on the dual shooting and combat Dreadnought. It isn't quite efficient enough for that role in my opinion, plus only moving 6 inches just isn't all that reliable for making combat. Overall, I'd rank them a 6 or 7. I'd put the regular Dreadnought at 6 and the Venerable Dreadnought at 7 out of 10. Not unusable, but not standout. It's interesting that I've seen a few competitive Grey Knight lists using allied Armiger Helverins as free blades for the same role as these guys. They're fast moving and objective secured, with a bit of long range firepower. Next up, we've got the Grey Knight Servitors, an elite's choice for 30 points. Servitors are a really weird unit to rate on these sort of things. On the one hand, they're not tough and they don't kill things. Typically that'd be a very bad thing in 40k, but in Grey Knights I think they have a special role. Just being a very cheap unit for 30 points has value all of its own. If you're playing against a list that's not going to be able to move fast enough to threaten them, then just park a unit of 4 Servitors on a home field objective, and letting the rest of the Grey Knights fight for the mid-board seems like a pretty good efficient use of points. If you're able to make them do actions like raise banners rather than sacrificing strike squads or interceptors to do that, then so much the better. And if your opponent's got some very scary deep strike threats coming in, then it's much better that they slam into these guys on the outskirts of your army rather than hitting the important units in the centre. For those reasons, if you have the slots free, I feel like a unit or 2 of Servitors is generally going to be quite a useful thing to have around. Don't expect them to do any real damage, but in a lot of matchups I think they'll be pretty handy for winning the mission overall. For those reasons I've scored them an 8 out of 10, fairly handy to have around but by no means mandatory. Elite's choice characters next, and first up we have the Grey Knight Ancients. There's the regular one and the Paladin Ancient. They both give +1 to hit in melee, and the Paladin Ancient also gives you +1 to the attacks of the Paladins, as usually the +1 to hit isn't actually going to be meaningful, as they already hit on 2s, it only matters if you're using things like Demon Hammers. They also get a Dominus cast as well, which could be handy for something like Warp Shaping, and as a character that's likely to be operating just behind the lines, they're quite a good option for things like buffing relics, traits or wisdoms, such as Heroism's Favour for some heroic intervention once per game, or that objective secured warlord traits to help support the paladins. On the downside, they do only have pretty limited threat themselves. Their damage attacks are only 1 with the Nemesis Falchion that they have to take. Losing access to a damage 2 weapon compared with other characters is a bit rubbish, and also their buffs don't help at range as well, only in combat, so are perhaps a little bit less helpful than their buffs compared with captains. If you did want to buff some paladin melee though, they're one of the only options, really not bad for that role, and pretty reasonable if you are taking a big squad of paladins that need to beat down the enemy. Overall, I think they're solid enough support characters, just a little bit more niche than most I feel. I scored them a 7 out of 10, though I might be persuaded to put the Paladin 1 to an 8 if it was buffing a big Paladin squad. Next up, we've got the Brotherhood Apothecary, another elite's choice for 100 points. This one does standard healing type things, a feel no pain type save for core Grey Knight units up close, restoring wounds to injured models, and a resurrection stratagem for 1 command point. Again, this guy seems pretty much made to buff those paladins, making a durable unit even more durable, and then painfully resurrecting a dead model each turn if you're willing to sacrifice the CP. As with other resurrection shenanigans, it can be pretty handy on a slow combat unit like those paladins. You can set up the slain model at the front of the unit and use it to make their charge range just that little bit shorter when they do come to charge later in the turn. On top of that, he also packs a Dominus power as well, and again he's a good option for buffs like the Ancient is. Heroism's favour or objective secured are both excellent on the Apothecary. On top of that, unlike the Ancient, he does have at least some fairly reasonable damage in melee, getting the option of a Force Sword for damage 2 and high AP. And in general, I think I do prefer these guys for supporting Paladins just that little bit over the Ancients. I'd rate the Brotherhood Apothecary 8 out of 10 overall. Moving on to the fast attack next, and Grey Knights just have the one option, but they are very good. Interceptor squads are now 26 points per model, basically like strike squads, but they move fast and through walls. Strike squads might hit a little bit harder with Hammerhand, but at least the interceptors have a decent threat range, so they should be able to get their powerful melee profile actually into combat a lot more reliably. On top of that, they've got some very nice stratagems such as teleport shunt to redeploy a unit. That can be as useful for secondary objectives and things as it is for actions. And if they happen to get tied up, then they can always fall back, shoot and charge, which makes them a massively disruptive threat that your opponent can't really pin down. Their psychic power, Ethereal Castigation, I think is just a little bit more on the niche side, but it can allow for some massive movement if you do need it. If they're not going to charge and they can shoot, and you just really want them to be flying towards objectives and maybe staying hidden at the end of the turn. On the downside, they're a little bit more points expensive than they used to be. They don't get hammer hands, so won't hit quite as hard as a strike squad, presuming you can deliver the strikes to combat. And again, they aren't troops and they don't have OBSEC. A lot of people do like to take a mix of these guys and strike squads. Both of them have slightly different roles, and you don't necessarily need the speed on literally everything. Heavy support next, and we'll start with everyone's favourite baby carrier. The Nemesis Dreadnought has been a bit of a workhorse of the Codex since the new rules dropped. 185 points with Sword, Silencer and Psy Cannon, which typically tends to be the most default choice. It's kind of hard to go too far wrong with a few Dreadnoughts in a list. They're pretty usable on all fronts, reasonably fast with their movement speed, fairly tough with their 2+ save and 4+ invul, a good generalist melee profile with that sword with Hammerhand, and perhaps some of the better range damage in the Codex with the core keyword to allow you to have some rerolls with a whole bunch of Psy Cannon and Silencer volume fire. On top of that, if you were running sword bearers, then they're even more tempting perhaps. Both their psychic power and stratagem can lead to incredible focus fire out of these things, and you can even double down further than that, say with a Grandmaster Dreadnought casting the Empiric Amplification and making all their Psi weapons extra damage. I'd say that Dreadnoughts are a pretty solid unit. I think that their use has been falling off a little bit recently. The rest of the Codex got Armour of Contempt, and these guys did not, basically toning them down a little bit in the context of the Codex, and they did have a small points cost hike since coming out. I've still chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10, though while I still think that they can be very strong, particularly in sword bearers, they're a bit less mandatory than they used to be. It does seem that plenty of Grey Knight lists seem to be managing without them. You don't necessarily see 3 or more in literally every single Grey Knight list, like back when the Codex dropped. Next up we have the Purgation Squad, a 22 points per model heavy support choice. They do come with the Incinerators and Silencers baked into that cost, though it will cost a bit more if you want to upgrade to Psy Cannons. The incentive to take these guys is spamming Psy weapons or Incinerators. Potentially falling out of Deep Strike they can do a fair amount of damage. Maybe multiple Incinerators might be one of the most interesting things for that if you did want to clear some infantry. And they do have a fair few options for amping up their damage with stratagems and Tides of the Warp. They can also get Astral Aim as well to ignore cover and get a couple of rerolls, though it's not really quite as good as the prior shoots round corner option that they had prior to this Codex's release. Unfortunately, I think that the points and support options just don't really add up to being quite strong enough on the Purgation Squad. The buffing stratagems are nice options, but realistically they just cost a little bit too much in command points to really be worth it. For the Silencers and the Psy Cannons, them being heavy means that they're usually going to be hitting on a 4+, And if you do want just mass psi weapon shooting, then Dread Knights with their heavy psi cannons and Gatling silencers will just generally do it a fair bit better, and they're still cool. They can unleash even heavier firepower at a decent move and still hit on threes, and that's kind of a hard set of things for the Purgation squad to overcome. Overall, I've ranked them a 7 out of 10. Again, not completely useless. A squad jumping out of Deep Strike with some incinerators can definitely do work, but I can see why most competitive lists tend to pass them up. Next up, we have the Land Raiders, 245 points base for any of the 3 different variants, and given their recent updates with a fairly recent points cut and the Armour of Contempt rule, they are at least fairly tough for the cost. If you are using something like Purifiers, perhaps they could be a decent battlefield bunker for them to charge out of, get this into the centre of the board, and then unleash the squad. Unfortunately, I just don't think that Land Raiders synergize very well with Grey Knights in general. I guess they could be a little bit more threatening if you happen to run sword bearers and actually make their firepower halfway scary. But in Grey Knight armies, it just seems that the vast majority of troops are much more happy walking than paying out for an expensive transport that might cost more than they do. And I feel that almost every list is going to be better off just taking around double the amount of bodies on the board as they are taking half the bodies and a Land Raider. As a straight up gun platform, other things will do that better, and if you are trying to make use of both of it as a gun platform and a transport, then you risk it being locked up and its firepower effectively being wasted. I think perhaps Land Raiders need more of a rules change than anything else. The Chaos ones got toughness 9 and better las cannons recently, that might go halfway to making them worth it, but at the moment I still wouldn't rate them all that good, even at the cheaper cost. I've chosen to rank them a 5 out of 10. I still think that you could make one work if you built around it, but maybe there's just not a lot of incentive to do so. Next up, we've got the Grey Knight Flyers, which I kind of feel fairly similarly to the Land Raider about. The big Storm Raven gunship with the transport capacity, the Stormhawk Interceptor for fighting enemy flyers, and the Storm Talon gunship for being fairly cheap and still packing some scary guns. Again, like the Land Raider, they just don't really synergize all that well with Grey Knights as a whole, though arguably in Sword Bearers they may be better than they might be for quite a few Space Marine chapters. You will need to commit to casting those psychic powers and using the stratagem, though, to making their firepower efficient. Flyers do have their advantages. Very fast movement means that they can gain line of sight on things that you might not expect, though if any firepower can draw a bead on them, or they get caught up with units nearby, then they're really quite easy to kill for the cost, and you could lose a lot of points investment very quickly before it's made enough of an impact on the game. The Storm Raven I still think is overcosted, though I guess it could theoretically transport some things if desired. The issue with that makes me think that if you put it somewhere where the transport contents would be useful, it's usually just going to get shot down anyway. And I guess the Hurricane Bolters are at least fairly interesting as well. You can pretty much guarantee a whole load of bolt shots on the enemy, and you could use that Cybolt ammo stratagem, which will increase their damage quite a bit. Otherwise, flyers in general just aren't really all that much help with objectives and things, meaning that they usually tend to be a bit of a luxury choice if you're running them, and you need some pretty big incentives to run them in the first place. Overall, I'd rank these a 5 out of 10 normally. Not excellent on the efficiency front, but the speed could be useful if you do desperately need to solve a problem. I'd rank them a little bit higher in Sword Bearers, maybe a 6 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Grey Knight Rhino, an 80 point cheap and effective transport choice. I think not too unreasonable for delivering something like Purifiers or Strike Marines. It can get them up the board a bit faster, and then being a battlefield bunker to charge out of when you're not having to pay for loads of other fancy guns and things like the Land Raider. In theory, if it survives enemy shooting, which it might do fairly well with Armour of Contempt and the option of smoke launchers, you could then have your squad disembark and get an extra boost towards combat. In general, competitive Grey Knight lists don't seem to make massive use of transports. I'd generally be much more tempted by things like Rhinos or Razorbacks over the big Land Raider though. At least this way you're not taking too many points away from the bodies on the line and getting the job done of getting the squads nearer to the targets. Again though, you do have to just weigh it up against devoting the points towards more bodies on the board, and a lot of lists seem to go that way. Overall, I'd rank it maybe a 7 or 8 out of 10. Usable enough with Purifiers or Strike Marines perhaps, but again certainly not mandatory. In a similar vein, we've got the Razorback, 100 points base now, so it drops a little bit compared with previous. Before I think I would have rated the Razorback below the Rhino, but now given the points cut, I think they're a bit more usable, and I'd rank them kind of the same. It's only got a 6-man transport capacity, but for Grey Knights that's not actually the biggest issue. You can still transport some fairly threatening squads with that, again like Purifiers, and then you can combine that with something like a couple of las cannons for some longer range fire support as well. They're still cheap enough so it's not a disaster if they just get locked up in combat and the firepower ruined, And again, like any vehicles with firepower, they are better in the Sword Bearer's Brotherhood. Otherwise, it's basically the same as the Rhino. A lot of squads are just very happy to use cover, jump from bit to bit, and countercharge the enemy when they get near, and the damage output still isn't super outstanding. Finally, let's go through the HQ choices, and first up we've got the more generic Brotherhood Captain and Grand Master. The Captain's 110 points base and gives you a reroll 1s to wound aura. The Grand Master gives you a reroll 1s to hit aura, plus gets you more attacks. These guys are in maybe a slightly weird place. Most of the time, the Codex's most generic HQ choices tend to be at least fairly tempting, but I feel like this pair really are overshone by some of the other options. The reroll auras are okay, but just not super outstanding for the points cost, and a lot of the other characters do fight pretty well in melee for the cost, and these guys maybe don't significantly outfight them. Also in Grey Knights, the durability difference isn't that much of an issue. They might get their 4+ invul save, but most of the other characters are safe behind 2+ saves anyway, so they don't gain that much on that front. Otherwise though, if you are running them, they could be a reasonable choice for Warlord traits and relics being some of the better melee characters, and the Brotherhood Captain does have his own special stratagem, 2 command points for Warp Locust, giving you a +1 to cast nearby. If you do need to absolutely guarantee there's an important turn of Psychic goes through with some clustered characters, then that could be worth it. Still perhaps a little bit expensive on the command point front though. As I said, in terms of weaknesses, I do feel that the other HQs generally just get a bit more tempting. If you're on a Grandmaster, it'll prevent you taking the Grandmaster in Nemesis Dreadnought, which is an incredibly threatening datasheet. And if you just want rerolls and things, a lot of people seem like they want to upgrade to Mr. Caldor Drago. Overall, I'd say that while these guys are perfectly usable, when comparing to the other Grey Knight characters, they don't often make the cut and get into competitive lists. Much better in my opinion is the Brotherhood Librarian, an 105 point HQ choice, who's also the most efficient source of Dominus casts, getting 2 for a relatively cheap cost. Lots of the powers are pretty useful: Gate of Infinity, Warp Shaping, or just Mass Mortal Wounds, and you can also mix it up as well, being the only HQ choice to take the Sanctic discipline, such as Cleansing Flame borrowed from those purifiers. One of the most common ways to run the Grey Knight Librarian is to use the Psychic Epitome Warlord trait for the extra mortal wounds when you cast, and then combine that with spells like Vortex of Doom and Cleansing Flame, and then you've suddenly got a massive amount of mortal wounds hoovering out of this guy each turn. Theoretically something like 10 mortal wounds if you do manage to get both powers cast. If you do want to make his casting more reliable for a turn as well, then the Gem of Enoctu is a pretty reasonable Wisdom of the Prognosticars to take on him, and even after the mortal wounds are done, that's not necessarily the end of his threat. He'll be able to chip off a little bit with shooting, and also has an okay melee profile too. It's not as dangerous in melee as some of the other options, but being able to blast entire elite infantry units off the board with mortal wounds alone is a pretty massive thing. If you can get all of those mortal wounds cast twice in a game, then there's a pretty reasonable chance that he'll have made his points back and then some. Moving on, we come to the Brotherhood Chaplain, 110 points base as an HQ choice. He gets you a single Dominus cast, and also your choice of Litany. Dominus casts are just generally helpful, and it's got a couple of really powerful ones to help out your squads in melee. Just getting 4 rerolls to hit is pretty excellent on something like a Strike squad, who might also have 4 rerolls to wound with Hammer Hand, or you could go for the Words of Power if you happen to be in Tide of Convergence, and go for lots of mortal wounds on 6s. Again, that one is pretty excellent with Hammer Hand as well. In general, I think it's a pretty reasonable choice if you're looking to sport things like Strike Squads or Terminators, maybe bigger with 10 unit bricks. Again, on his raw stat line, he's maybe just not quite as dangerous as a few of the other HQ choices. He does certainly face competition from things like Apothecaries, Brotherhood Ancients, and Captains for buffing the same squads, and unlike things like Space Marines, you can't upgrade him to be able to cast 2 different litanies in a turn, which would be kind of handy. Overall, I'd say very usable though. I've scored him an 8 out of 10. The Brotherhood Champion is a 70 points, really quite cheap HQ choice. He is the cheapest one if you need to fill a slot, and is basically a Grey Knight hero on a budget. He's got the single most efficient Dominus cast outside of the Librarian. He's an expendable character with some melee threat, and he also has a 6-inch heroic intervention and fights first versus characters. He retains a 2+ save with some Artificer armor, though unlike Terminator characters, it does mean that he can go in rhinos and things, which is kind of handy if you wanted to support a squad moving up in a transport like that. On the downside, he is so much cheaper for a reason, I think. He doesn't provide any reroll auras or major support. The melee is okay, but not really outstanding. And I feel like for the extra 20 points or so, Castellan Crow is a bit of a tempting choice over this guy. Extra attacks, wounds, mortal wounds in melee, and having the Purifying Flame are all quite good things. Next up, there's the Brotherhood Tech Marine, which is 80 points, and if you're taking him along, it would usually be to repair Dread Knights and give them +1 to hit. To be honest, I find Tech Marines kind of weirdly efficient within Grey Knights. If you are running lots of Dread Knights, they're really not a bad choice. They'll be able to pile a bunch more wounds on, make them a bit more dangerous, and they still get a Dominus cast, and they're one of the more efficient Dominus casters at only 80 points for the ability. On top of that, they can amp up their repairing with the Etheric Conduit. An automatic 3 wounds heal per turn is pretty nice if you can do it once or twice, and once they get into combat, they're not useless either. A bit of close range shooting combined with a few powerful attacks, they certainly hit a bit harder than things like Ancients for the points cost. If you aren't running 3+ Dread Knights, then they're going to be a bit more of a questionable pick, and they might at least somewhat struggle to keep up with a Dread Knight advance. Still though, an efficient enough buffing character, I'd rate them an 8 out of 10. Next up, one of the rock stars of the Codex with the Grandmaster in Nemesis Dread Knight, an HQ choice for 215 points if you equip him with the relatively common upgrades of Psycannon, Silencer, and Nemesis Force Sword. You can also upgrade him with a personal teleporter as well for 10 points, a fair few people choose to. This guy's just an all-round powerhouse, all the Nemesis Dread Knight things that are scary but hitting on 2s rather than 3s. These guys are often given the Sigil of Exigence relic, which makes them just enormously hard to deal with. If your opponent tries to shoot at them, then they can instantly teleport somewhere else on the board, hopefully somewhere that's completely safe from shooting, and also is going to cause the opponent a headache next turn when they get to do their own damage once more. Plenty of people like to combine that with a few extra points for Servant of the Throne, the Wisdom of the Prognosticars thing that gives you a turn of big durability with 3+ invul save to shrug off attacks. A combo of a really nasty damage dealing unit that with the 2 different upgrades the opponent is really going to struggle to deal with. It's a pretty awesome 1-2 punch. On top of that, they know 2 Dominus powers and can cast 1. Things like Gate of Infinity can have him hopping across the map to shoot something different. Vortex of Doom can throw out a bunch more mortal wounds and add insult to injury, and Empiric Amplification can tune up his own psi weapons, and also potentially those of other nearby Dread Knights who he could work in concert with. He gives his rerolls to nearby Dread Knights and other core units. He's got great synergies with the Sword Bearers being a vehicle, and is an awesome choice for Warlord traits as well. Potentially the one to grant objectives secured is quite nice. I do quite like a few of the others, such as First to the Fray as well. +1 to charge on this guy could be quite good if he's gating across the board, giving a pretty reasonable chance of getting into combat with that massive melee damage. Certainly a lot going on with this guy, and I do think he's very strong. He is fairly points intensive, and he can be shot directly once the sigil is dealt with though. And once his durability tricks are gone, he's not actually all that hard to remove, particularly in combat. He doesn't get Armour of Contempt, and he does cost 250 points. Still though, a very strong unit. I could see why people want to spam multiple of these back when you could. Now you can only take 1, but it does happen to be the best one with those relics and wisdoms. Overall, I've scored him a 9 out of 10. Staying with Powerhouse HQ choices, next we come to Caldor Drago himself, the 180 point Supreme Grandmaster of the Grey Knights, who if you want to have a Captain or Grandmaster, typically this guy is almost always worth the extra points upgrade in my opinion. His melee is just on a completely different level compared with them. Strength 8, AP 4 and damage 3 from the Titan Sword will pose a threat to just about anything that he can hit. He gets not 1 but 2 Dominus casts, so it's basically a Librarian plus a Grandmaster rolled into 1. He gets the upgrade of Chapter Master style rerolls thrown onto a core unit, great on just about whatever he targets, and he can use it on himself if he just wants that little bit more melee. And he is going to be harder to remove than most other Grey Knight characters, a 3+ invul all the time, excellent when paired with command rerolls on a key big damage result. Perhaps the main downsides are being relatively expensive, a slightly poor Warlord trait, and no choice of wisdoms or relics, but in the command point starved era of Nephilim, he's pretty excellent I think. I'd score him a 9 out of 10, and a very reasonable include in most Grey Knight lists. Quite handy in the way that you can run him alongside a Grandmaster Dread Knight as well if you want to. Next up we've got Castellan Crow at 90 points. I'd say out of the Grey Knight unique characters, he's the other good one really. 90 points for a boosted Brotherhood champion. Not too bad for his melee profile, special rules and psychic support. He gets a mighty 6 attacks with that cursed blade of his, hitting on 2s and strength 5 damage 2 with extra mortal wounds on 6s. If he gets killed in close combat, he gets to go down swinging and fight in death. He gets fights first versus characters, a nice big heroic intervention of 6 inches, which makes him kind of hard to keep out of combat with if you're trying to charge something nearby. and his warlord trait is one of the rather good ones, getting a +1 to wound with that nice blade in the first round of combat. On top of that, he also gets the option of either Purifying Flame and a Dominus power to cast each turn. If you aren't running something like a Librarian with all the mortal wounds, then being able to throw extra mortal wounds out of this guy is nice, never mind a Dominus power being at least relatively efficient at 90 points. His main downside is that, like the other champion, he doesn't really buff enemy nearby units that much. Not too bad to have as support though if they are charged, and I guess he just feels maybe a little bit less necessary than other characters, but I think including him in the battle line as a bit of a countercharge threat is really going to be all that bad an idea. Overall, I've scored him an 8 out of 10, a very solid melee character. I must admit I'm a bit less positive about Brother Captain Stern. I think he's got quite a lot of disadvantages going on, to be honest. 120 points for a unique character, 10 points more than a standard Brother Captain, though he does get +1 attack, and also that access to the stratagem for +1 to cast nearby. Otherwise, for the cost, his special rules just really aren't all that standout. He gets an extra few mortal wounds on demons nearby. I guess not too bad if you know that you're going to be fighting them, but against the field it's pretty poor. And then his Strands of Fate reroll ability is kind of bad. Being able to reroll hits and wounds for himself is quite nice, but then you basically gift your opponent free command point rerolls that they could use on something far more powerful, so it's usually going to be a trade-off that's going to hurt you more than it helps you. He's also locked to Ward Makers, and while he can field him in other detachments with Honoured Knight, it does potentially prevent some synergies with him and the rest of the force, and he costs more than Brother Captains that do something fairly similar without any choice for powerful relics, warlord traits, and wisdoms. In general, I think he's underwhelming even compared with standard Brother Captains, which aren't particularly standout in the first place. Definitely feels like a suboptimal HQ choice, even if realistically he isn't all that far behind. I'd score him a 5 out of 10. Finally, we have Grandmaster Voldus, an 150 point Grandmaster. Basically, he does two things differently. He gets a more dangerous Demon Hammer than normal, which hits on 2's base, rather than giving you the -1 to hit, and he also gets 2 casts on the Dominus discipline. Again, he is locked to the Ward Makers, so can't make use of other Brotherhood synergies, and it means that you'd rarely want to field him outside of Ward Makers, as he only grants his rerolls to them. On top of that, you don't get any choice of relics or warlord traits either. His Lawmaster one, I guess, isn't too bad for casting on Psychic. It does mean that you're less likely to get denied, though again, maybe I feel like it's just a little bit niche for wanting to field regularly. He's only 30 points behind Drago, who I think is just so much better, and being locked to the Ward Makers really doesn't do him any services. Provided you are running Ward Makers, I guess is not too terrible. I've ranked him a 7 out of 10, though again he's certainly on the niche side. So I think that just about finishes our roundup of all of the Grey Knight's choices in 9th edition 40k. I hope you found at least some of the discussion helpful, and please let me know any alternate takes or interesting strengths and weaknesses that I've missed down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll most certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'm sure we'll have plenty more faction overviews like this one coming on the channel. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on Auspex Tactics, I would just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which is down in the video description below. Making all the videos, particularly long in-depth ones for niche factions like this, does take an awful lot of time investment, and if you do find these sort of things helpful, then any support on the Patreon page is massively appreciated. I'd not be able to justify making quite as much time on the lesser played factions of 40k quite as much without the support over there. If you have been enjoying the videos quite a bit, feel free to check it out. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early each month, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.